Welcome back to the 715 podcast, everybody. We got Dr. Carol Craig in from Chippewa Valley Votes to talk a little bit through kind of this next process of the next month or so before we hit election day here. How are you doing, Dr. Craig? Or I'll say Carol. Sorry, I forgot that you preferred Carol here.
Yeah, I prefer Carol Craig. I'm doing really well. It's a busy time of the year, of course. Everybody is out there promoting their candidates. They're out there promoting voter registration, promoting voting early. I mean, this is just a really busy time for people that are concerned about what's happening in our public offices.
Could you give a little more kind of in-depth of who you are? And you had a great resume that you sent us. Could you give our listeners a little bit more on who you are and kind of what your role is here in this process?
Sure, Grant. Well, you know, who I am is really an individual who's been concerned about making sure everyone has a fair shot at life for all of my career. I was a school psychologist for many years, and people used to say, Carol, all you care about are people who are underprivileged and no money. And I would say those are the people who really need our energy right now. And actually, Grant, I was elected to the school board, Eau Claire school board, when I was 32, on the idea that we need to give everybody an equal opportunity in schools, that we have to make sure decisions that we make in schools are not just for the athletes or who can go to special sports camps, but also those kids who don't have moms and dads at home, who long to be involved in sports and extracurricular activities but can't, who really need to have special programming because of some deficits that's not really up, their issues or their concern. I mean, I don't imagine that you know what it'd be like coming home and not knowing where your parents were, and wondering where your next meal might come from, and wondering how you're going to get your homework done when you've got 3 brothers and sisters that are needing of your attention. So for the next 23 years, I served on the school board, and I want to tell you that I am really proud of the Eau Claire Area School District. They are really cutting edge and making sure that decisions they make are student-centered. And that's really how they got involved with Chippewa Valley Votes. Part of DPI, which is Department of Public Instruction, requires that every high school senior have competencies in civic engagement, specifically related to voter registration, and specifically related to being able to evaluate candidates and evaluate the issues. And quite honestly, we found that wasn't happening. And it's really not through anybody's fault. It was just simply the curriculum was so compact, and you would have a civics class when you were a freshman, and maybe you talked a little bit about voting then, but you never talked about it again until you never talked about it again. That was the one civics course I think that you had. Help me, Jackson or Grant, was civics required in high school?
We took a government class, and that's kind of so we took government is necessary for junior year. Yeah. In order to pass that class, you have to take your civics exam and pass the 60% or whatever it does to take to pass that thing. But yeah, government and then U.S. history is kind of the two that I would say would be kind of close to that.
So when you take your government class as a junior, and you may talk about voter registration and you might not, and you might talk about candidates and you might not, but really, if you can't vote until you're a senior, it's sort of like giving you driver's education when you're 14 and then say, well, when you're 16, go out and drive your car. There's that gap that's there. And I think the staff at Memorial and at North recognized that gap, and they collaborated with Chippewa Valley Votes to make sure that every senior has the opportunity to know how to register to vote, to actually register if they so choose, and then how they analyze the candidates and the issues and what's important to them. So we've been doing that now in all of the high schools in the area: Altoona, Chippewa Falls, Augusta, Fall Creek, North, Memorial, of course, for the last 3 years. And it's been just a great opportunity for us to get back into the classroom, but also to energize seniors and get them fired up for the election. I was just going to say, do you know that your age block though 18 to 25 constitutes the largest voting bloc in the United States right now.
I had no
the
idea.
problem is only less than 50% of you even turn out to vote.
Yeah.
But 70% of of people who are 70 years and older turn out to vote. So you've got these 70-year-olds who are turning out like crazy. And the question we would ask is, do you want your grandma and grandpa to determine what issues are important? Do they really understand student loans? And do they really understand climate change and fair wages and the needs for gun safety? So if your age block doesn't get out there to really prepare yourself for the future, it's a real disservice to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those stats I've never heard before. Carol, then what else has Chippewa Valley Votes done to kind of spark this interest in getting people, especially young people, that opportunity that you said to go out and speak their voice and have a say in what's going to be going on?
Well, when they did surveys on young people your age, it's easy to say, they just don't care. They're too involved in their sports, and they're too involved in dating and all those things. Well, the fact of the matter is, surveys indicate that young adults are not apathetic, but no one has ever said to them, this is how you register to vote. This is what you need in order to register to vote. These are things that have to be done. And here are the polling places or the clerk's office where you actually register to vote. So once we expose seniors to the very easy process of registering to vote, you'd be surprised how excited they are, how engaged they are, how they start critically analyzing some of the issues that they ultimately will be voting on. As you go to the polls this November 3rd, you have two stark different candidates here. And it may seem that a lot of your colleagues in Memorial are one way or the other, like completely polarized. But when you start talking about something so simple as what is a fair wage for you as you start looking at jobs, there's no easy answers. There's not a politician that actually can come up and say, this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it. That's why having critical conversations with seniors in high school, with young adults at the university, we're at the university as well, to get them thinking about it, and then having faith that they will make the right decision based on their values. Every vote, frankly, is a reflection of what you value. If you vote for example, increased tuition, that means that you value, let me see, that's an interesting example. I might take that back here. Why would you vote for increased tuition at the universities?
I don't know.
You wouldn't, right? But that block of 70-year-olds, remember that, they're the one that's showing up at the polls. That block of 70-year-olds say, you bet, increase their tuition. I don't want my taxes raised. Go ahead and increase that tuition. So there are always, sort of counter arguments. You don't want tuition high, but somebody else does want it high. You don't want, for example, to have the voting age changed to 21, but somebody might want it to change to 21. Or I don't know how you feel about student loans, whether or not there should be some practice that somebody who has a student loan has to take out a student loan. And by the way, Grant and Jackson, you will be taking on average about $35,000 out for your college costs and expenses if you go to a 4-year college. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So those are to get into the schools and get into the classrooms and start talking about what this really means. What does student loan really mean? And why can you reduce the interest rate on a student loan, but excuse me, I'm going to back that up. Why can you reduce the interest rate on a car loan, but you can't a student loan? Again, certain politicians are making those decisions. So what we then do is say, there's a whole list of resources that you can go to find out, what does this candidate stand for? What are his or her issues? What will he or she likely vote for once they're in public office? And we distribute a list of very nonpartisan. And by nonpartisan, what we're talking about is it's not as though it's a Republican or a Democrat position. It's rather a neutral position. We distribute a list of resources that students can go to and investigate and take a look at the various candidates. I don't know if you've had a chance to go to any of those websites. Just the simple Vote 411 is probably the classic one that people go to, or another website that's real common is what's called Vote Smart. I don't know if you've seen that. If other people see this podcast, I'd really have them recommend that they look at Vote Smart as well.
Okay.
Because you can look at the candidate and it talks everything about their bio and things like that. Sorry, I'm talking a lot here.
No problem at all. Another topic I wanted to go over is the voting process in general. So for people like us who have never gone to a polling place or voted before, how does that process usually work?
That's a great question. There are three ways you can actually vote. One, you can request an absentee ballot, and that's very easy to do. And you can go on the My Vote website and request it. And then you mail that back in. You could, if you wanted to, because you want to avoid lines, or maybe you can't make it on November 3rd, you could go in person October 20th through October 31st to actually vote in person at City Hall. But traditionally, what individuals do is they go to the voting place on November 3rd. You walk in, and almost always there's a very large sample ballot, so you know what the ballot looks like. I remember the first time I went in there, I thought, oh my, I'll never figure this out, but I did. You'll see the sample ballot. You'll be able to take a look at it. You can ask questions. There are people who are there to answer your questions about the ballot. You will present your photo ID. In Wisconsin, it's required as of the last 5 years to have a photo ID. They will say, state your name and address. You'll state that, and they will then give you a ballot. Most places have a screen that you go behind. You fill out your ballot. And if you make a mistake, you can simply say, I made a mistake, and it happens very often. I'm a poll worker. You'd be surprised. Anyone from 18 to 80 come back out and they say, I need a new ballot. You can get a new ballot. Actually, you can get up to 3 ballots. Once you're finished filling them out, you take it and it goes into a machine, and it automatically calculates and secures your ballot that you filled out. Sometimes you don't know that you made a mistake. And so as they put the ballot into the machine, it'll spit back out, and they'll say, oh, you put down 2 on this. You can't do that, or you failed to do this. And they won't look at who you voted for. They'll just spit it out and give you a new ballot. So I guess the point I'm making is that probably like when you got your driver's license and you got in the car the first time, you sort of knew what you were doing, but you also knew that, you may have to ask some questions, and the first couple of times it may seem a little uncomfortable, but it's just as easy as can be to go vote. The voting hours are 7 in the morning until 8 at night. A lot of people during the COVID-19 situation are choosing to go early vote. It's called in-person early voting at City Hall, right across from the library downtown. If you live in a township, all of the townships also have early voting. You would just simply call the town of Brunswick or the town of Union or the town of Washington and say, when is your early voting, if you chose to do that. So it's really pretty easy.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say this. Today is the very last day that you can register online under My Vote. I think that was the program that most of your seniors had the opportunity to register. If you haven't registered, let's just say you don't turn 18 until October 23rd, you can go in person to register. And what you need to do that is a proof of residence. And I think you all kind of know that. It's easy for you all because you have a driver's license. You just walk down and say, here. But what about people who maybe are living in Milwaukee, for example, and they don't have a driver's license, are living in a situation where they're not capable of getting a driver's license? How do they register to vote? And again, those are some of the hoops and loops that we can help individuals with. We go to homeless shelters, we go to community table, we go to high schools. It's kind of interesting. The three of you are all in that same group: homeless shelters, community table, high schools. Helping anyone really who has questions or who needs to get a proof of residence. To register, you need to prove where you live. To vote, you got to prove who you are with a picture ID. Pretty simple with that. So
Awesome.
that's really what it would look like if you went to the polls.
So how has the virus and pandemic changed that voting process for this election?
Well, first of all, what it's done, sadly for us, is kept us out of the high schools. We would always go into the high schools, into the senior classes, oftentimes in the fall, but more often in the spring. But certainly for the November 3rd presidential, we wanted to get into the high schools and we couldn't. So we then prepared an online interactive program for seniors. We have a lot of individuals who are very concerned about COVID exchanges at the polling places. So they're opting to get an absentee ballot. But quite honestly, Jackson, people are saying, well, my absentee ballot's not secure either. What is the post office doing? What if somebody is not being truthful with my absentee ballot? I want to make sure my vote gets counted. So my sense is, and my experience right now is that a lot of people are voting early. You probably saw on the news just yesterday, voting early started and they had these long lines. We started voting, we will start early voting October 20th. So I think that's how it's changed it. We will have more people voting early than any time in our history. And hopefully that will cut down on the lines at the polling places on November 3rd, and then cut down on the possibility of having any type of virus exchanged.
As far as the information that young people get to kind of decide who they vote for and what they go and do when the polling day actually comes, you mentioned those other websites. Are there other ways that kids should, or young adults should, be aware of their opportunities where they can gather more information?
Well, that's a great question, Grant. There are, and I will tell you that historically, from a research point of view, if your parents were Republican, chances are pretty good you're going to sort of incorporate the Republican ideology. If your parents were Democrat, you're going to incorporate that into your value system. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but what I am saying is that possibly you as an individual haven't given it the individual thought that you really need to have critical conversations with people who are diverse in thinking, with your friends and colleagues and your teachers, to expand your perspective on what is important under our Constitution and what are values that I hold dear, and how can I make sure I'm voting for those. So I think talking with each other, and a lot of times, I think you've probably seen this in your family, we don't talk politics. Everybody's too angry about politics. Well, that's the antithesis of democracy. Democracy was founded on coming together in a common place to discuss and create new ways of solving problems. It took the forefathers, I think close to 11 years to actually agree on the Constitution from beginning to end. During that time, there was great debate, critical thinking, challenging each other. And I think that's what we really have to do. Websites are a pretty lacking dynamic way of learning. It's much more important to pay attention to what people are saying and find reliable resources. I will tell you my own personal opinion that I think these 30-second ads or 1-minute ads on TV that they're paying $250,000 for, that is not objective. It's designed by market people to tap into a particular motivation. So I'm hoping that that's not primarily the way that seniors and young adults are getting their information. There's many more opportunities to do it. Just have those courageous conversations with teachers, with your relatives, with friends, other people who you look up to and respect.
Awesome. I have another question for you. If there was you mentioned that civics is typically something that's either taught too early or not taught at all. If there was one thing that you could add to a high school curriculum, what would you add?
Um, the opportunity to have controversial and critical dialogue on matters that are very important to young adults, to middle-aged adults, to older adults. Frankly, I have seen, and as a member of the school board, I have witnessed that controversial, critical discussions are lacking. And a lot has to do with the fact that parents don't want teachers to expose their student to a particular ideology that they don't believe in. I'm just going to use as example, okay, just as an example, a really strong and clear debate about segregation and slavery. Some people feel that that's controversial. I will tell my children what I want them to know about Afro-American segregation, all of those factors. And the school board actually passed a policy, I don't know if you know this or not, actually passed a policy that said, if a teacher is going to talk about anything controversial, they have to notify the parents in advance, and the parents can allow their child not to be exposed to that. To me, that's just not what good education is about. Good education is moving toward an understanding of things that you disagree with, understanding why certain people believe that way, understanding how you can resolve the differences and come to some mutual agreement that's in the interest of the common good. That really is what United States is based on, the interest of common good for all people throughout the nation. And we won't do that if we don't allow each other to have controversy and discussion about those controversies and resolve them in a critical and diplomatic way.
So in regards to that, how truly different is this election? I know we've been hearing from a lot of people that have been like, yeah, this is a weird election year. In what ways is it different or better or worse, I guess?
Can you just expand a tad on why they feel it's a weird election year?
I guess in regards to candidates mainly, particularly with how the last debate went, or it's not as, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess as presidential as previous years or professional. Is it something that's truly different than what's we've been seeing the years before? I mean, because this is our first election truly looking at all of the information that's coming in, and you hear a lot of people saying, yeah, this is a different one. There's a lot more to think about here.
Yeah. Well, if you think back to what I just finished saying, for me anyway, is one of the more important things that young adults can do, and that is to have civil conversations about matters that are important. The last presidential debate was the complete opposite of that. So in that regard, the example that those two presidential candidates put forward to young adults was embarrassing. That is not how we solve problems, by being really quite disrespectful, and certainly not following the norms of any debate. The other thing that's a little weird about it, if you're going to use the word weird, I'm not sure that would be my word, but it's a little weird that we have two individuals that are 74 and 77 years old, and they're talking about the vice presidential candidates as much as the presidential, because they're saying there's a higher probability that one of the two might be in there. So all of a sudden, the vice presidential candidates are getting as much, I think, discussion and as much concern or critique as the presidential candidates. The other thing is that we've got this COVID-19, and quite honestly, what's coming out of one candidate's mouth is the direct opposite of what's coming out of the other candidate's mouth. And that's a sad thing, knowing that we can't even agree on facts in terms of how we handle a health challenge. And I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. Chippewa Valley Votes doesn't do that. It's not our intention. We're just simply saying that that's a very unusual thing to not be able to agree on a certain health strategy to move us through COVID-19. And then lastly, I think the other factor, a lot of people, I think, were not involved in the 2016 presidential election. And as things happen to evolve, they are saying, I am going to vote this year. I stayed home last election. I am not going to do it this year. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to vote. I'm going to get involved. I've seen more yard signs. I've seen more pins. I've seen more parades. More people are civically engaged right now. And in some ways, that's lovely. That is the essence of democracy. People getting out there and expressing their values, and hopefully then voting for a candidate who matches their values. That's what you really need to do, is what values do I have about education and health and gun safety and climate and environment, and who then will best reflect my values. If you do that, Jackson and Grant, you'll be voting for the right person.
Perfect.
Well, one of the things I just want to reiterate, and I did do it superficially. It may sound like I was criticizing the high schools. I was not criticizing the high schools. Their roles have changed so dramatically in the last 10 years. It's amazing. Standardized testing has taken such a precedent that maybe there's not time for these critical conversations and this ability to have dialogue. So I understand that, but I'll tell you, when Chippewa Valley Votes asked if they could come in and collaborate with the faculty were 200% behind it. Your staff was 200% behind it. The counselors were, the building principals were. I mean, everybody just embraced the idea that community volunteers, and there were about at each school at least 40 plus community volunteers, were willing to come in and provide this service for the seniors, so that, quite honestly, high school teachers wouldn't have to get up to speed and have to somehow figure out how to put this in addition to their curriculum out there for students. So you can be really proud of your faculty, of your staff, of your administrators. They've been just delightful to work for. And because of them, over the course of 2 years plus, we've registered probably close to 1,900 students. So that's a real plus. Now you just got to get you out there to the polls.
Yeah.
Less than 50% of you who are eligible to vote don't go to the polls. We got to get you going. One of the questions that we almost start every conversation with after you're registered is, what is your voting plan? And they'll look at you like, what do you mean? And we say, well, what is your voting plan? What's your plan to make sure your ballot gets there? Are you going to vote absentee? Are you going to vote in person? Have you registered? Have you checked your registration? Do you know where your polling place is? In Eau Claire, for example, there's over 27 different places that you go to vote, and you only have one place that's assigned to you. A lot of people would walk into a voting place and they think that they should be able to just vote at any one of those, and would be very frustrated that they couldn't vote there. And I don't know whether they would go find their actual voting place and vote or not. When people get frustrated and it seems to be more of a challenge to vote than it is a convenience, maybe they don't vote. So that's one of the things that we really want to do, is ask people after you're registered, what's your voting plan? And I think the more we talk about voting plans, the higher the probability that young adults, and again, ages 18 to 25-ish are the largest voting bloc right now. The more I think that they will realize that it's an important responsibility.
So not only do you guys organize events for the high school, I know you guys also do a lot of community work. So could you kind of talk about some of the community work you do and what demographics you're aiming for there?
Sure. That's a great question. Throughout the year, not just during election time, but throughout the year, Chippewa Valley Votes sets up voter registration booths at various public venues, whether it be the International Fall Fest, whether it be our summer concerts at Phoenix Park and Owen Park, whether it be setting up a voting registration booth at the Eau Claire Government Center for people who are walking in and out of the Eau Claire Government Center, asking them, have you registered to vote? it's kind of interesting because most will say, yeah. And we say, well, can we just check? Can we just check to make sure we know where your polling place is? Because on My Vote, you're familiar with My Vote, right? That website, or maybe not. All right. So you can check your voting place. You can check your absentee ballot if you have to change your address. And we'll pop their name and their birthday in there, and it'll say not registered. And they go, really? I thought I was registered. And all of a sudden, we start the process for them. People really, I think, are a little bit embarrassed, I think, if they're not registered. So they just sort of say, yep, I'm registered. So we ask if they've had a change of address. If you're registered, Jackson and Grant, but you head off to college next year or move outside of your parents' address, you have to re-register. You have to change your address on that registration ballot. And a lot of people don't know that. In fact, freshmen and sophomore at the University in Eau Claire here, if they move from Towers Dorm 211 to Towers Dorm 217, they have to re-register. And a lot of times students say, why do I have to do that? What's the sense of that? I'm not going to say that I know the sense of it. I just know that that's one of the obstacles and one of the things that we have to really make sure young adults realize, that when you move, you have to re-register and prove your residence again. So let's see. So we set up these voting places throughout the city. We also go to homeless shelters, because you can imagine it's hard to prove where you live if you're homeless, isn't it? I mean, and sometimes maybe the very people who need to vote and need to put forth values that reflect what their needs are people who are homeless. You actually can vote if you're homeless. What you need to do is to have verification from someone who can testify that you're homeless. And once they have that documentation, then they can get their proof of residence. Then they need to get a state ID, of course, because they don't have a driver's license. So that's, again, something that takes some time and effort. Sometimes we spend as much as 2 or 3 hours with an individual getting them ready to vote. But once they're ready, you know that they're going to vote. They just simply will vote. We've gone to community table. There's a lot of individuals who go to community table. I should say did go to community table. Again, one of those changes for Chippewa Valley Votes is that we can't go to community table because during COVID-19, they're not even there. It's been a really kind of a frustrating time for us. But once things get back up again, we would be providing services to the community table. Wherever anybody would like us to come, we will be there. JAMF, for example, every election cycle and during the summers, because they have a lot of people who come in and out, they ask us to come and set up a booth there at JAMF for their new employees to make sure that they're registered. It's interesting. Some places of business feel that they don't want that political activity in their place of business. But I guess that's their choice. But wherever anyone invites us, you can bet we will be. In fact, we just set up a mobile bus in Eau Claire 2 months ago for voter registration at Phoenix Park. There are no concerts or anything like that, but we had this traveling bus that advertised and marketed the importance of voter registration and voting. Registering is one thing. Voting is the last and final step of that. So that's why it's the voter plan is really an important thing.
Wow.
So that's how we serve the community.
Is there really that much of a difference in the number of people who register and the number of people who vote?
Well, yes.
Wow.
There's 2 factors there, Jackson. When the statistics are reported at the end of this presidential election, they will say that in Wisconsin, I'm just projecting this, but I think I'm going to be pretty close, 70% of the voters turned out to vote. Those are voters who are registered. It doesn't count the fact that there are probably still, again, 25% of the people who are eligible to vote, but who never registered.
Wow.
So if you looked at that number, Yeah. That's only 70% of those that are registered is what that statistic reflects. It doesn't reflect all of those who aren't registered. We have a lot of people. We have a lot of people who are not registered to vote. You would be surprised. Take your laptop or your iPad or your smartphone and carry it with you and just ask various of your relatives, neighbors, friends to punch in their information to see if they're registered. And they will say, nah, I'm not going to register. That's just baloney anyway. It doesn't, my vote doesn't count. Well, that's not true. It does count. So when you see that statistic, it's 70% of the eligible voters. It's not 70% of all those that actually are age eligible to vote. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's very interesting. It's not something that I really thought about before, I guess. I just assumed that when you register, most people went to vote, but that's a very interesting thing to think about.
Well, even if you are registered, not everybody shows up to vote. But it's those people who could register and could vote that don't show up that Chippewa Valley Votes really wants to address. You're registered, that's great. We give you information about where your polls are and your voting plan, but we're really out after those individuals and a lot of individuals who are not registered to vote. I'm going to say the vast majority of high school seniors, their first year out, they're not registered and they're not voting. Now that we've got you into the hopper, so to speak, and you are registered and you do know the importance, I think we're going to see a pretty significant increase. When I taught some classes at the university, you used to talk about how AARP, you don't know what AARP or ARP is, do you?
No.
It's the retirement thing, isn't it?
Yeah, way to go. Yes, Association of Retired People, they have dominated elections forever because they're registered and they vote. I would often say that what we really need is AAYP, the American Association of Young People. If we had a complement of that with ARP, because you are the largest voting bloc, you could control politics. And I try to emphasize how critically important it is that you could actually control what's going on in our country if you turned out like people in ARP or the 70-year-olds turned out. So you might want to think about starting an AAYP, American Association of Young People.
But then my other question
What was your question,
Carol,
Grant?
Yeah. What does your guys' job look like after Election Day on November 3rd? What kind of goes about Chippewa Valley Votes after the big main election's done?
Yeah. Our year continues on. We're already setting up venues for summer events, because if we can get people registered ahead of time rather than just during an election, there are a lot of different elections that go on, not just in November. There's spring elections that happen. There's school board elections. And in fact, you too can vote for school board candidates in April. That's really important. Who is your school board and what do they value and who is it that you really want to elect? So there's elections going on in the fall and the spring. There are sometimes certain primary elections. So voting and registering is a lifelong sort of cycle, but it's also a yearly cycle that we tap into. So we have activities set up all year long. And we've got volunteers who just really enjoy the voter registration process. So they really look forward to it. So this is not a sort of a one and done after the November 3rd. And that's what we talked to the memorial staff about, that this isn't all about just this election. It's about registration and civic competencies across the board. And they really bought into it very well. So that's what it looks like. But I'll tell you, we need to get a handle on this COVID-19 in order to get back to being able to meet the needs of individuals in a holistic sort of way, whether it's voter registration or healthcare or education. Your education right now is a lot different than you thought it would be in your senior year, isn't it?
Yeah, big time.
Yeah, it really is. do the people that made decisions about sports, were they elected? Do you know, Grant? I know you said that some of your sports was canceled. Do you know if they were elected?
I think the main reason why our sports were canceled were because of the people in the county health offices, and I do not think those are elected positions. I'm not for sure on that, but I think I've heard the main reason why we can't play in the fall is because our school district is following the guidelines that our county put out, and many of the county positions aren't elected positions.
Right. And you're right that the health department isn't elected, but they are under the authority of an elected county board and city council. And so right now you may have heard in the news that they're trying to pass an ordinance that would allow the health department to have some enforcement authority. And citizens are saying they're not elected, so I don't think they should have enforcement authority. And so that's an important discussion. Yeah. You know, no representation or no taxation without representation. That historical landmark, it basically said, you can't mess around with me unless I have an opportunity to elect you. And we really need to have the democratic process at play in matters of health as well. Most individuals don't understand who makes decisions, though, about how much your tuition is going to cost, what the speed limit might be, whether or not you can bring your car to school. You know, the school board could determine right now that they don't want anybody having cars at school, and they could pass a policy that says no one can bring cars to school. They have the authority to do that, and that's why knowing who's on the school board or the county board or the city council and what their values are really is an important thing for all of you to be aware of. But most people are not aware of that. So, how are things at Memorial? Are people excited about the election? Are you got some posters up? Do you have the young Dems and the young Republicans discussing anything at all going on at Memorial?
There's a little bit of buzz between just some of my friends and some people just like in the lunchroom, you know, talking about the last debates or stuff that they've been seeing. As far as kind of the debates between the two clubs, I don't think we're having any clubs this year. So none of that stuff's really happening. So I guess COVID-19's kind of had an impact on that. But yeah, I'd say between the people who are eligible to vote and who have said that they're registered, they're excited and they're ready to go finally have a say in this thing.
Yeah, I'd say more than discussions in person. I see a lot more posts online or reposts online of either candidates or other pages that are spreading some fact. And I've been seeing a lot more of people reposting stuff that they also believe in. So that's been interesting to see. And you do learn a lot from people reposting stuff online. And I think it's a very important part of voting now.
I think posting online is great. The one challenge, though, is it doesn't really allow for a critical conversation. Mm-hmm. It tends to be very static, you know?
Yeah.
But it's better than nothing. That's for sure. It's better than nothing. So I have a quick question. Do you think that your faculty should be allowed to wear candidate pins to express the candidate that they support?
Man, I've never thought of that question.
I guess that could apply to students too.
Yeah.
Because really, even in regards of students wearing whoever they support, we don't really see much of that either.
The thing that's kind of racing through my head is you wouldn't want a student to think any less, or in that matter, any more of someone based on that view, or because they have a certain view on that candidate, to then have a bad interaction or a better interaction, you know, both ways with that teacher. And so I don't know if to totally avoid it is the right way to do it. I just don't know what the way to go about that is, you know. And I don't know. That's just a really tough question, and I'm glad I don't have to like make that decision. Is that something that's kind of been being discussed through board meetings and stuff?
Well, actually, no. Well, yeah, maybe 20 years ago, it was perfectly legitimate for faculty to have discussions and maybe wear a pin. I think there's a couple of your social science teachers that still have all sorts of paraphernalia up. And it was perfectly legitimate. And I think it was done with the intention of having some dynamic discussions about why this individual felt that way, exchange of ideas, and really as educators to promote students to think about what candidates stand for. But as I said, as people began shying away from controversial topics, and politics being one of them, then the idea of even talking politics in a high school setting became less and less viable. And I think right now they actually do have an ordinance, a policy at the school board level that does not allow faculty to bring any type of political paraphernalia in support of. And quite honestly, I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Mm-hmm.
Silence isn't necessarily the best solution to the controversies that we're having right now. But your point's well made, Grant, that it could create some friction. If I'm a Trump supporter and you have a Biden pin on, all of a sudden that seems to be reason to not like somebody rather than to engage them in a conversation.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't have to be that way, but unfortunately, I think that's the kind of the reality we've been put into. And I think it comes down to the two candidates that we have. I mean, they don't have civil discussion, so why would somebody think that they could have a civil discussion with somebody who's opposing views as well? So I like I said, I don't think it should be that way, but unfortunately, that's kind of how I think it would maybe go.
Yeah, but as students and citizens of Eau Claire, you can go to the school board and ask them to review that policy and ask them why they feel that's still an appropriate policy. Look it up. All you have to do is go on the website and look up that policy regarding political activity, and have a discussion. I mean, that's what democracy is all about. That would be great. Do you know who's on your school board, by the way?
To be completely honest, not really. No.
I know who our representative is. I know who our memorial representative, Emery Toole, is our student rep there. But I went to the board meeting and I remember names like Torres and Harder and Bika Harrison, and those are the two or three that pop off my head right away, but not as well as we probably should.
Well, I would say, Grant, that you are probably in the top 1% of seniors at Memorial or North that could even rattle off 3 names. Seriously, that's amazing. As it is, Eric is no longer, he resigned before his term was over, but really to school board members love being connected with students and connected with in a really policy oriented way. Like, here's this policy on political paraphernalia in the schools. Can you help me understand how this promotes good democracy? I think that would be a great discussion to have. And just because it's that way now doesn't mean that into the future we can't do some things that would allow more conversations and critical thinking about politics. Even if we had after class forums or groups or activities that you could voluntarily get involved with, but that's neither here nor there. I'm off on a tangent now.
It's all good. That's the beauty of the podcast.
That's all good. You're right.
You can go off on the tangent and be perfectly fine about it. So
I can't emphasize enough how important voting is. And quite honestly, in my professional and personal opinion, what's happened to our country in the last 2 decades is because citizens haven't been engaged. They've been very busy. We've had some challenging economic times. Moms and dads are working several jobs. We shy away from political discussions in our classrooms. we've just not engaged our citizens to be part of the process the way that democracy demands it to be. And I'm really optimistic as we move into this election, but also into this next 4 years or 5 years, with people your age who are engaged now, who are saying, I can change the world. I can make a difference. I'm going to get involved. I'm going to be registered. I'm going to expect my elected officials to be accountable. I'm going to make some changes about how much money controls decision making. I mean, until citizens get engaged, they're not going to be able to move forward in a cohesive manner to make sure public policy represents who they are as a country. And right now we're very divided, and I think we need to move toward more and more engagement, conversations, critical thinking, more and more volunteer work, more and more understanding of the issues. And you know better than I do what's going to happen with our climate, what's going to happen with our economy. I don't know how much you make an hour if you even have a job, but to try to make a living and raise a family on $25,000 a year, it's not going to happen. People get angry, they get frustrated, they turn to drugs, they lose hope. And our country was framed on hope and on change and promoting the common welfare of all of us. And together we can do that. But it's going to take you and I. It's not going to take a politician in Washington, D.C. or Madison without civic involvement in that. So thanks for caring about these issues and having these kinds of discussions, even on this podcast. It reflects what gives me optimism in your age group. So thank you. It's been great.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. We appreciate the insights that you gave us today, and we hope to continue to spread those views and the importance of getting out to go and vote to our classmates and peers also.